The morning sun cast long shadows across Officer James Miller's bedroom as he stood before his mirror, adjusting his police uniform with trembling hands. Every crease, every button, every detail had to be perfect today. This wasn't just another shift. This was perhaps the most important day of his 15-year career with the Chicago Police Department. His eyes drifted to the family photo on his dresser. There she was, his beloved Annie, her smile radiant even in her final months. The memory of her laugh still echoed through their now quiet home. 3 years of fighting cancer had drained not just their savings, but also their dreams of sending their daughters to college. Speaking of his daughters, he could hear them downstairs. Little Jenny was probably helping her older sister Katie pack her lunch for school, just like they'd done every morning since their mom passed. They'd grown up too fast, forced to become little adults in a world that had turned upside down. The convention center would be packed today. Miller had memorized every detail of the security briefing, former President Trump's route, the checkpoints, the positioning of every officer. As he rehearsed his plan in his mind, guilt gnawed at his conscience. Breaking protocol went against everything he stood for as a law enforcement officer. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The stack of medical bills on his kitchen table had grown into an insurmountable mountain. Last week's final notice from the hospital had been the last straw. He was running out of options, and his daughters deserved better than to lose their home after already losing their mother. The drive to the convention center was a blur of autumn colors and racing thoughts. Miller's police radio crackled with the usual morning traffic updates, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept rehearsing what he would say if he got the chance. "Mr. President, I know this is unusual, no, too formal. Sir, I need your help." Too desperate. Finding the right words seemed impossible. As he pulled into the staff parking area, Miller noticed the growing crowd of supporters already forming outside the venue. Campaign signs waved in the morning breeze as vendors set up their stands. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the clear blue sky like metal trees. Inside the security briefing room, Miller sat with his fellow officers, nodding mechanically as the head of security reviewed the day's procedures. His colleague Pat noticed his distraction and nudged him. "You okay, brother? You look like you've seen a ghost." Miller forced a smile and blamed it on lack of sleep, but Pat's concerned look suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. The weight of his decision pressed heavier with each passing minute. Miller had always been the steady one, the officer others could rely on in a crisis. His supervisor had even recommended him for a commendation last year after he talked down an armed suspect without any violence. But today, he was about to risk everything: his reputation, his career, maybe even his freedom. As the morning wore on, more security personnel arrived. Secret Service agents in their dark suits and earpieces began their methodical sweep of the building. Miller watched them work, knowing that in a few hours he would have to find a way past them. The thought made his stomach churn. He stepped outside for some air, watching as the crowd grew larger. Among them, he spotted a family, a father with 2 daughters about the same age as his own. They were laughing, excited about the day ahead. The sight nearly broke him. That should have been him and Annie, taking their girls to special events, making memories together. Back inside, Miller checked his watch for the 100th time. 2 hours until the motorcade's arrival. He patted his breast pocket, feeling the folded photo he'd brought. Annie in her hospital bed, still smiling, surrounded by their daughters. It was his reminder of why he had to try, why he had to risk everything on this desperate gamble. As he took his position near the security checkpoint, Miller said a silent prayer. Not just for courage, but for understanding. He'd hoped that somehow the former president would see past the breach of protocol and recognize what this meant, not just for him, but for his daughters, for Annie's memory, and for all the other first responders out there struggling with similar battles. The crowd's growing excitement told him it was almost time. Miller squared his shoulders and took a deep breath. Everything he'd worked for, everything he believed in as an officer, would be put on the line in the next few hours. But as he thought of his daughters' faces and the home they might lose, he knew he had no choice. It was time to take the biggest risk of his life. The roar of helicopter blades cut through the morning air as Trump's motorcade approached the convention center. Officer Miller's radio crackled with updates from his fellow officers, their voices tense with the responsibility of maintaining security for such a high-profile event. His palms were sweaty against his leather-duty belt as he watched the growing excitement ripple through the crowd. All units be advised. Motorcade is 5 minutes out. The voice of his supervisor, Lieutenant Chen, was steady and professional. Miller checked his position near the security checkpoint for the 100th time. From here, he had a clear view of where the former president would enter, but more importantly, where there might be a brief moment, just a few seconds really, when he could make his move. The crowd pressed forward, their phones raised high, ready to capture every moment. Miller recognized some of the faces from his regular patrol route. The elderly couple who ran the corner store, a teacher from his daughter's school, even his local mail carrier. Their presence made what he was about to do even harder. These were people who trusted him, who saw him as a symbol of order and security. His colleague Officer Thompson moved closer, adjusting his earpiece. "You're awful quiet today, Jim. Everything okay?" Miller nodded, trying to keep his voice casual as he responded, "Just focused on the job." Thompson seemed satisfied with the answer, but Miller caught him glancing over with concern a few more times. They'd worked together for 8 years, long enough for Thompson to know when something was off. The first black SUVs appeared at the end of the street, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. Miller's heart hammered against his ribs so hard he worried others might hear it. He thought of the letter in his pocket, the one from the bank about foreclosure. He thought of his daughter's faces when he dropped them at their aunt's house this morning, trying to hide the worry in his eyes. Secret Service agents materialized seemingly from nowhere, their movements precise and coordinated like a well-rehearsed dance. Miller had trained with some of them during his time on the force, learned their protocols, understood their routines. Now he was about to use that knowledge to do something he never thought he'd do: break those very protocols. The crowd's energy surged as the main vehicle approached. Miller could see his fellow officers tightening the security line, their faces set in professional masks of concentration. He thought of Annie, how she'd always supported his career choice even on the hardest days. "You're making a difference," she'd say. Today, he hoped he could make a difference for their family, even if it meant risking everything. Time seemed to slow down as the motorcade came to a stop. Miller's radio buzzed with constant updates, but they seemed distant now, like sounds underwater. He watched as the Secret Service took their positions, his trained eye noting the subtle hand signals they exchanged. His moment would come soon, if it came at all. The crowd's cheers grew deafening as the car door opened. Miller felt a bead of sweat roll down his back despite the cool autumn air. He thought of all the times he'd stood guard at events like this, proud to be part of the thin blue line protecting others. Now he was about to step across that line, and the weight of that decision pressed on his chest like a physical thing. Through the sea of raised phones and campaign signs, Miller caught glimpses of the former president's familiar figure emerging from the vehicle. The Secret Service moved with him like a choreograph unit, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd. Miller knew their patterns, knew they'd be focused on the obvious threats: anyone moving too quickly, any suspicious packages, any sudden movements in the crowd. What they wouldn't be expecting was one of their own, a uniformed officer, breaking rank. The thought made Miller's stomach turn. In 15 years on the force, he'd never once violated protocol. He'd built his reputation on being reliable, trustworthy, by the book. Now he was about to throw all that away on one desperate gamble. He felt the letter in his pocket crinkle as he shifted his weight. Along with it was the photo of Annie in the hospital, smiling despite everything, their daughters hugged close to their sides. The medical bills had started arriving before they'd even laid her to rest. 3 years of treatment had drained every account, maxed out every credit card, and still it hadn't been enough to save her. The former president was moving closer now, shaking hands with supporters in the front row. Miller's radio crackled again. Updates about crowd movement, security positions, timing estimates. His fingers tapped against his holster, a nervous habit he'd developed during his rookie years. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong, that he should stay in position, do his job, follow protocol. But then he thought of Jenny asking why they might have to move, of Katie trying to hide her college acceptance letter because she knew they couldn't afford it. He thought of the promise he'd made to Annie in those final days. that he'd take care of their girls, that he'd find a way to give them the future they deserved. The moment was approaching. Trump was almost at Miller's position, the Secret Service agents scanning their sectors with professional precision. Miller's hand moved to his badge, touching it one last time like a talisman. Everything he'd worked for, everything he believed in, would be on the line in the next few moments. But as he watched the former president draw closer, Miller knew there was no turning back. It was time to risk it all on one desperate plea for help. Time seemed to freeze as Officer Miller watched Trump move through the crowd. The familiar sounds of the convention center faded away. The cheering supporters, the clicking cameras, the steady chatter of security radio, all of it became distant background noise to the thundering of his own heartbeat. This was the moment. Trump had just finished shaking hands with an elderly veteran in a wheelchair, his signature smile bright under the convention center's lights. The Secret Service agents were scanning their sectors, their movements as precise as clockwork. Miller knew their patterns, knew that for just a few seconds there would be a small gap in their coverage as they repositioned. His throat felt dry as sandpaper as he took one step forward, then another. He could feel the eyes of his fellow officers on him, could almost hear their unspoken questions. In 15 years on the force, he'd never broken formation, never stepped out of line. But then again, he'd never been this desperate. "Mr. President," the words left his mouth before he could second-guess himself. His voice carried across the space between them, clear and steady despite his racing heart. The reaction was instant. Secret Service agents snapped their attention toward him, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Miller kept his own hands visible, away from his duty belt. The crowd around them hushed, sensing something unusual was happening. Phone cameras swiveled in his direction, capturing every moment. Miller could see his colleague Thompson's confused expression, could feel Lieutenant Chen's shocked stare burning into him. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Trump had stopped walking. The former president turned, his expression curious rather than alarmed. Maybe it was because Miller was in uniform, or maybe it was something in his voice, that note of genuine desperation that couldn't be faked. Whatever the reason, Trump held up his hand, a subtle gesture that kept the Secret Service from immediately removing Miller from the scene. "Sir," Miller continued, his voice slightly softer now but still carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. He could feel sweat trickling down his back under his uniformed shirt. The weight of what he was doing, breaking protocol, risking his career, possibly even facing charges, pressed down on him like a physical thing. But then he thought of his daughters, of Katie, who'd hidden her college acceptance letter because she knew they couldn't afford it, of little Jenny, who still left cookies out for her mom sometimes, forgetting she was gone. The memory gave him strength, helped him find his voice again. The Secret Service agents had formed a tighter circle now, their faces professionally blank but their bodies tense, ready to move at the slightest sign of threat. Miller knew their training, knew exactly how many different ways they were prepared to take him down if he made one wrong move. He kept his posture open, non-threatening, even as his heart raced. Trump took a half-step closer, his head tilted slightly in curiosity. The crowd around them was completely silent now, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Miller could hear the soft whir of news cameras, knew this moment was being captured from a dozen different angles. His hand moved slowly toward his breast pocket, telegraph every movement so the Secret Service wouldn't misinterpret his actions. He could feel the worn edges of the photo through his uniformed shirt. Annie in her hospital bed, still smiling despite everything, their daughters cuddled close on either side of her. "I know this isn't the right way to do this," Miller said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to choke him. "I know I'm breaking every rule in the book. But, sir, I don't know where else to turn." The words came easier now, flowing from a place of raw honesty that couldn't be rehearsed. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as Trump studied him. Miller could see the calculations happening behind those eyes. Was this a security risk? A publicity stunt? Or something else entirely? In that moment, Miller felt completely exposed, as if every struggle of the past 3 years was written across his face. The crowd started murmuring, their phones still raised, capturing every second of this unexpected drama. Miller could hear snippets of their whispered conversations, their speculation about what was happening. But he kept his eyes locked on Trump, silently willing him to understand, to listen, to help. Finally, Trump nodded, just a small movement, but it was enough. The tension in the air shifted slightly as the former president took another step toward Miller, close enough now that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the crowd. The Secret Service adjusted their positions accordingly, still alert but following their principal's lead. In that moment, as Miller prepared to tell his story, he sent up a silent prayer of thanks to Annie. She'd always told him that sometimes you had to be brave enough to ask for help, even when it scared you. Standing there, under the bright lights and countless cameras, about to risk everything on one desperate play, Miller had never felt braver or more terrified in his life. With trembling fingers, Officer Miller pulled the one photograph from his breast pocket. The convention center's bright lights caught the glossy surface as he carefully held it out. The image showed a scene that was forever burned into his memory. His wife Annie in her hospital bed, their 2 daughters snuggled close, all 3 somehow managing to smile despite everything they were going through. "My wife, sir," Miller began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "She fought cancer for 3 years. The best doctors, the newest treatments, we tried everything." He paused, swallowing hard. The crowd around them remained eerily quiet, hanging on every word. Even the usually stoic Secret Service agents seemed to be listening intently. Trump studied the photograph, his expression softening as he took in the scene. The political persona seemed to fade slightly, replaced by something more human. Miller pressed on, knowing this might be his only chance. "She made me promise to take care of our girls. Katie's 17 now. She got accepted to college, but," his voice cracked slightly, "the medical bills took everything we had." The former president handed the photo back carefully, as if he understood its precious nature. Miller tucked it back into his pocket, right next to the final notice from the bank that had arrived yesterday. "I've never asked for help before," he continued. 15 years on the force, I've always been the one helping others. But now," he gestured to his uniform, the badge that had been his pride for so many years, "I'm about to lose our home. The same home where my wife took her last breath, where my girls grew up, where all our memories are." The words came faster now, tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "I've picked up extra shifts, sold everything we could spare, but it's not enough." A light breeze rustled through the convention center, carrying with it the soft murmur of the crowd. Phone cameras continued recording, capturing every moment of this unexpected scene. Miller could see news reporters at the edges of the crowd, speaking quietly into their microphones, but their words were lost in the heavy silence that hummed between him and the former president. "The hardest part," Miller said, his voice dropping slightly, "is watching my girls try to be strong. Katie got a part-time job after school, even though I told her to focus on her studies. And Jenny, she's only 12, but she keeps saying she doesn't need new clothes or school supplies." He blinked hard, fighting back tears that threatened to fall. "They've already lost their mother. I can't let them lose their home too." The autumn sun caught the silver threading in Trump's hair as he listened, his usual rapid-fire responses notably absent. Behind him, his staff exchanged glances, some already pulling out phones and tablets. Miller could feel his colleagues' eyes on him, some sympathetic, others shocked at his breach of protocol. But he kept his focus on the man before him, putting everything he had into these moments. "I know this isn't how things are supposed to be done," Miller acknowledged, standing straight despite the weight of the moment. "I know I'm risking my job just by standing here. But sir, when you've got nothing left to lose except your children's future." He let the sentence hang there, heavy with unspoken meaning. From somewhere in the crowd, a baby started crying, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. It reminded Miller of nights spent walking the halls with his own daughters when they were small, Annie humming lullabies as she rocked them back to sleep. Those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime now, before cancer came and tore their world apart. Trump glanced at his chief of staff, then back at Miller. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that still hung in the balance. Miller could feel his future, and more importantly, his daughter's futures, balanced on the knife edge of this moment. "I'm not asking for a handout," Miller added quickly, his professional pride still intact despite everything. "I just need a chance to keep my promise to my wife, to give our girls the future she dreamed of for them." His voice grew stronger, fueled by the love for his family that had driven him to this desperate act. They're good kids, sir. Smart, hardworking. Everything parents hope their children will be. They deserve better than this. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how the former president would respond. Miller stood his ground, years of police training helping him maintain his composure even as his heart thundered in his chest. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about the cameras or the crowd or even his career. All he could think about was Katie's hidden college acceptance letter and Jenny's too small winter coat from last year. The next few seconds would determine everything: his family's future, his career, possibly even his freedom. But as Miller waited for Trump's response, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Whatever happened next, he'd done everything he could for his girls. He'd kept his promise to Annie the only way he knew how, by being willing to risk everything for their children's future. The convention center fell into a deeper silence as Trump took a step closer to Officer Miller. The usual buzz of activity that followed the former president everywhere seemed to pause, as if the whole room was holding its breath. Even the Secret Service agents, though still alert, appeared to be caught up in the moment's gravity. "You're a brave man," Trump said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. It wasn't his usual booming rally voice, but something more personal, more genuine. Not many people would risk their career like this. He gestured to one of his staff members, who quickly approached with a notepad. Miller felt his legs go weak with relief. They weren't going to arrest him, at least not yet. He watched as Trump turned to his chief of staff, speaking in low tones. The staff member was nodding, typing rapidly on his phone. Around them, the crowd had grown even larger as word spread about what was happening. "Tell me about your daughters," Trump said, turning back to Miller. His tone was different now, not the voice of a politician, but of a father who understood what it meant to want the best for your children. Miller noticed how the former president kept the photo of Annie and the girls visible in his hand, glancing at it as they spoke. "Katie's a straight-A student," Miller replied, his voice growing stronger as he talked about his children. "She wants to be a doctor. After everything that happened with her mom, she's determined to help other families." He paused, collecting himself. "And Jenny, she's got her mother's spirit. Still leaves little notes around the house to make me smile, even when I know she's hurting too." Trump nodded, his expression thoughtful. He turned to another aide and said something that made the younger man start writing furiously in his notebook. The crowd around them had started murmuring again, phones still raised to capture every moment of this unexpected scene. "Medical bills are crushing good people," Trump said, loud enough now for others to hear. "Crushing our police officers, our first responders, the very people who take care of us." He placed a hand on Miller's shoulder, a gesture that surprised both the officer and the Secret Service detail. "This isn't right." Miller watched in amazement as Trump began giving rapid-fire instructions to his team. One aide was already on the phone, speaking quietly but intensely. Another was taking down Miller's contact information, asking about specific bills and amounts. It was happening so fast, Miller could barely keep up. "We're going to help you," Trump announced, his voice carrying across the convention center. "Not because you asked, but because you didn't ask until you had no other choice. That says something about your character." The crowd erupted in applause, but Trump held up his hand for silence. "And we're going to make sure other officers know they're not alone." Miller felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of relief. He watched as Trump's team efficiently gathered his information, the names of his doctors, his bank details, even Katie's college acceptance letter details. It was like watching a well-oiled machine spring into action. "Your wife would be proud," Trump said quietly, during a moment when his staff was busy coordinating. "Not many men would have the courage to do what you did today." He glanced at the photo again. "She had a beautiful smile. I can see where your daughters get it from." The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity. Trump's team had created a preliminary plan right there on the spot. They would work with local charities, set up a fund for first responders facing similar situations, and most importantly, ensure that Miller's immediate crisis was addressed. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help," Trump said, addressing both Miller and the crowd now. "This man puts his life on the line every day to protect others. Today, we're going to protect him and his family." The crowd's response was immediate and emotional, Applause mixed with sniffles and cheers. Miller stood straighter, his police training helping him maintain composure despite the overwhelming emotion of the moment. He could already imagine telling his daughters that things were going to be okay, that they wouldn't have to leave their home, that Katie could go to college without worrying about the cost. Trump's final words to him were quiet, meant just for Miller's ears. Take care of those girls. They've got a good father. Then, with a final pat on Miller's shoulder, the former president turned to continue his scheduled walk through the convention center, leaving his staff to finalize the details with the overwhelmed officer. As Miller watched Trump move away, surrounded again by his security detail and staff, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Real, tangible hope. His hand moved to his breast pocket, where Annie's photo rested next to his heart. I kept my promise, he whispered, too softly for anyone else to hear. I found a way. By the time Officer Miller left the convention center that evening, his story had already started spreading across social media like wildfire. Cell phone videos of his encounter with Trump were being shared thousands of times, each one carrying the raw emotion of that moment to new audiences. But what happened next surprised even Miller himself. The local news station's evening broadcast led with the story, showing clips of the encounter from multiple angles. The anchor's voice was sympathetic as she described Miller's situation. A 15-year veteran of the force, facing the loss of his family home after his wife's battle with cancer. The story struck a chord with viewers across the city and beyond. Miller's phone started ringing nonstop. First, it was his fellow officers. His partner Thompson called, his gruff voice unusually emotional. You should have told us, buddy. We take care of our own. The precinct's break room, usually filled with casual chatter, now buzzed with conversations about healthcare costs and family struggles that officers had kept hidden for years. By the next morning, the story had gone national. Major news networks picked it up, not just for the dramatic moment with Trump, but for what it revealed about the challenges facing first responders. Miller's inbox filled with messages from other police officers across the country, sharing their own stories of medical debt and financial struggles. Dad, we're trending, Jenny exclaimed at breakfast, showing him her phone. The hashtag #HelpOurHeroes was spreading rapidly, with people sharing stories of first responders who had impacted their lives. Some were posting about starting fundraisers in their own communities, inspired by Miller's courage to speak up. The local coffee shop near the precinct put up a sign. Police officers eat free this week. You take care of us. Let us take care of you. Other businesses followed suit, offering support in whatever ways they could. The owner of a small diner where Miller often got his morning coffee told reporters, he's been serving our community for 15 years. It's time we served him back. What touched Miller the most were the letters. They arrived at the precinct by the dozens, then hundreds. Some contained small donations, $5, $10, whatever people could spare. But it was the words that brought tears to his eyes. Your wife would be proud, wrote one elderly woman. You helped my grandson last year during a traffic accident, wrote another. Now it's our turn to help you. The police union called an emergency meeting. Miller's story had shown a light on a problem many officers faced silently. They announced plans to create a new emergency fund for officers facing catastrophic medical expenses. Officer Miller's courage in speaking up has shown us where we need to do better, the union president announced to reporters. Local religious leaders and community organizations began working together, setting up a network to identify and support first responders facing similar challenges. It's not just about Officer Miller anymore, Reverend Johnson told his congregation. It's about all the heroes in uniform who need our help, but are too proud to ask. Katie and Jenny watched it all unfold with a mixture of amazement and pride. Mom would love this, Katie said one evening as they sorted through another batch of supportive letters. She always said one person's courage could change things for everyone. Jenny nodded, carefully placing each letter in a special box they'd gotten just for this purpose. The most unexpected support came from local children. Schools across the district organized penny drives and bake sales. A fourth-grade class sent hand-drawn cards, each one expressing thanks to police officers in their own unique way. One particularly touching drawing showed a police officer with angel wings, like Officer Miller's wife watching over him, the young artist explained. 2 weeks after that life-changing moment at the convention center, Officer Miller sat at his kitchen table, staring at a stack of papers in disbelief. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, catching the tears in his eyes as he read through them one more time. Trump's foundation, combined with the community's overwhelming support, had not only covered his remaining medical debt, but had created something much bigger. "Dad?" Katie's voice came from the doorway. She was already dressed for school, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Is everything okay?" Miller looked up at his daughter, remembering how she hidden her college acceptance letter just a few weeks ago. Now that same letter sat proudly on the refrigerator, no longer a source of stress, but a promise of the future. "Everything's more than okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Come here, both of you." Jenny appeared behind her sister, and both girls joined their father at the table. "Remember how Mom always said that good things can come from hard times? Well, look at this." He showed them the documents from Trump's team. The foundation had set up a national support network for first responders facing similar situations. Miller's story had become the catalyst for change that would help countless other families. The girls read through the papers, their eyes widening as they understood the impact of what had happened. "So other police officers won't have to worry like we did?" Jenny asked, her young face serious. Miller pulled her close, remembering how she'd offered to sell her bicycle just a month ago to help with bills. "That's right, honey. And not just police officers, firefighters, paramedics, all the people who help keep our community safe." The doorbell rang, and Katie went to answer it. She came back with Lieutenant Chen, who had become a regular visitor since that day at the convention center. "Thought I'd stop by before shift," he said, holding up a box of donuts, a peace offering of sorts. He'd felt guilty about not noticing how much his officer was struggling before. The new support fund helped its first family yesterday, Chen announced as they sat around the table. "A firefighter in Boston. His kid needs special medical care." They were about to lose everything, just like. He trailed off, but Miller nodded understanding. The ripple effects of his desperate act were still spreading, touching lives across the country. Miller's phone buzzed, a text from Thompson, his partner. "Channel 5 wants to interview you again," it read. "They're doing a special report on the changes in first responder support programs." Miller smiled, remembering how nervous he'd been about that first interview. Now, telling his story felt like a responsibility, a way to help others find the courage to ask for help. Jenny pulled out her mom's photo from the special frame on the wall, the same one Miller had shown Trump that day. "Mom would be really proud," she said quietly. "Remember how she always told us that angels work in mysterious ways?" Miller hugged her close, thinking about how right Annie had been. Their darkest moment had somehow become a light for others. The kitchen started filling with the morning routine, Katie making coffee, Jenny feeding their cat, Chen sharing updates from the precinct. It felt normal, comfortable, like family. This was what Miller had been fighting to preserve, not just the house, but these moments, this sense of home and community. "Oh, I almost forgot," Chen said, pulling out an envelope. "The mayor wants you to speak at next month's police academy graduation." Miller started to protest, but Chen cut him off. "They need to hear your story, Jim. Not just about asking for help, but about how one person's courage can change things for everyone." Later that morning, as Miller got ready for his shift, he paused by the mirror where he'd stood that fateful day, adjusting his uniform with trembling hands. The same badge gleamed on his chest, but it felt different now. It wasn't just a symbol of his duty to protect and serve. It was a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a protector can do is admit they need protection too. Before leaving, Miller stopped at the small table where they kept Annie's photo. "We did it, honey," he whispered. "The girls are okay, the house is safe, and somehow we've helped a lot of other families too." He could almost hear her laugh, could almost feel her saying, "I told you so." She'd always believed that everything happened for a reason. As he walked to his patrol car, neighbors waved and called out greetings. The morning sun caught his badge, making it shine. In his pocket, he carried a letter he'd received yesterday. A thank you note from another officer's family who'd been helped by the new support network. Their words echoed in his mind. "Your courage gave us courage. Your story gave us hope." Miller slid behind the wheel, ready for another day of serving his community. But now he did so with the knowledge that he wasn't just protecting his city, he was part of something bigger, a movement that would ensure no other first responder would have to choose between their duty and their family's future. And somehow, he knew Annie was smiling down on all of it.